continue to conduct these complex negotiations in the best interests of Canadians. It's a negotiation.
Imagine this. You're playing chess, but your opponent suddenly flips the board and demands you surrender all while the clock keeps ticking. Sounds absurd. Yet that's exactly what's happening in the trade standoff between the US and Canada. With tariffs, political brinkmanship, and jobs on the line as the deadline looms. There's a question that has many American families uneasy. What happens if everyday goods from Canada suddenly get much more expensive? On July 11th, a letter sent to Prime Minister Carney spelled it out unless a new deal is reached by August 1st. Canada may face a 35% tariff on most imports that do not follow the USMCA. While countries like the UK and Vietnam quickly made concessions, Canada stayed silent, leaving Washington in a holding pattern. For households, the stakes are clear. If the threatened 70% tariff goes into effect, the price of steel, aluminum, and prescription medicines could jump, pushing up living and healthcare costs, right? As many are already watching their budgets closely. In just the next 2 months, out-of-pocket expenses for some basic medicines could rise by $12 to $15 per month, making it harder to manage fixed household budgets. Imagine being a dairy farmer in Wisconsin and hearing that access to Canadian milk markets has tightened once again. On June 30th, Canada paused a planned 3% digital tax on giants like Amazon and Google, a move that seemed designed to bring both sides back to the table. But the fine print told a different story. New Canadian rules have quietly locked in tight quotas, some up to 300% on milk, eggs, and poultry, especially in provinces like Quebec and Ontario. That means U.S. farmers hoping to expand north will likely find the door closed. Meanwhile, families across the Midwest may notice that milk prices at home remain high, as the chance for cheaper Canadian imports fades. Over the next month, a gallon of milk could stay up by $1 compared to last year, making weekly grocery bills a bit heavier. While attention stays fixed on tariffs, Canadian companies are quietly looking elsewhere, backed by a new $6.5 billion Canadian dollar support package. Industries from steel to EV batteries are boosting exports to Europe, Japan, and the UK. Canada's government is helping businesses send more products abroad and waiving taxes on key parts from Southeast Asia, making it easier to withstand American tariffs. For U.S. manufacturers, the competition is about to get sharper. Canadian goods are set to grab a bigger share of markets that once belonged to American producers. As a result, U.S. exporters could lose about 5,000 orders for machinery and farm equipment over the next 2 months, a number that hits especially hard for those relying on steady contracts. Picture life along the Detroit-Windsor border, where thousands of families depend on cross-border industry. With the July 21st deadline approaching, both sides are digging in. Washington threatens to raise tariffs on Canada from 35% to 70%, while Ottawa is using delay tactics to buy time. The risks are immediate and concrete. If the highest tariffs take hold, more than 45,000 jobs could be lost in the Detroit-Windsor region alone, pushing both Ontario and Michigan toward a technical recession. For local families, that means tough choices ahead, potential layoffs, smaller paychecks, and more pressure on household finances. Within the next month, unemployment rolls in the region could grow by 4,000 people, leaving many to wonder how long the standoff can last.
Industry, businesses, Canadians, they are anxious, and they want the right kind of resolution. They want a deal that makes sense for Canada, that makes sense for Canadian business, for Canadian workers.
They used to deliver fresh milk every morning and form the rhythm of whole towns. But now, many small dairy farms in the U.S. are quietly shutting down. No protests, no headlines, just empty shelves where familiar milk used to be. Why did an industry that once saw 20% export growth end up with thousands of farmers losing their livelihood? What's really going on between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico that turned milk into a weapon in the silent trade chess game? In 2024, Mexico was the largest market for U.S. dairy exports, making up nearly 1/3 of the total value. By USDA data, Canada ranked second, but with barriers. Under Canada's supply management system, they impose quotas and harsh tariffs, sometimes near 298.5% on milk imports that exceed limits. A Cornell University study published in March 2025 says Canada has started some concessions to expand access for U.S. milk under USMCA, but so far only on paper, with no big changes in actual import volume. If you buy milk from Mexico or Canada today, you may soon see fewer options and rising prices. For example, a box of Mexican imported cheese that used to cost around $5 is now frequently priced near $6. Thanks to supply instability and shifting tariff rules, by Q1 2025, U.S. dairy exports reached about $714 million, up 20% from the year before. According to the Dairy Export Council, but volume rose just 0.4%, so most of that gain came from higher prices, not more milk shipped. Despite those figures, many small farms keep closing. In 2024 alone, 1,420 dairies shut down, about 5% of the total nationwide. Smaller farms are squeezed out by high production costs and limited market access, while large industrial farms survive thanks to automation and scale. If you live in regions like Wisconsin, Vermont, or Idaho, you may have noticed your local grocery store no longer stocks the fresh milk you used to buy at around $4.20 per gallon. Instead, you now see cheaper industrial versions for about $3.60, less consistent in taste and origin. A Café en Laconia, New Hampshire reported switching away from local organic milk, drawing customer complaints over flavor changes. In 2024, the U.S. produced over 226 billion pounds of milk, around 102 million tons, near historical highs. Average milk yield per cow is nearly 6 times what it was in the year 1924, showing how much mechanization has increased. The United States usually exports processed dairy products. Cheese worth $2.4 billion, non-fat dry milk valued at $2 billion, and lactose and whey totaling $1.9 billion rather than fresh or fluid milk. Canada operates a very different model. Through supply management, they set output ceilings, guarantee minimum prices for farmers, and slap heavy tariffs up to near 300% on any imports that exceed quotas. Farms are strictly regulated from feed and housing to final milk quality. This system has earned Canada strong trust among global buyers, including Mexico and European markets, despite a much smaller total volume than the U.S. For American consumers, that means it's easier to find inexpensive cheese and powdered milk, but much harder to get high-quality, imported fresh milk. Meanwhile, in Mexico, Canadian milk, though slightly more expensive, is often preferred for its consistency and traceable standards. This shift is making it harder for U.S. dairy farmers to compete and turning tariff policy into a double-edged sword.
As we just heard, the U.S. president railed against Canadian dairy and lumber industries, claiming the U.S. is being, quote, ripped off.
Once a symbol of American agriculture, the dairy industry now falters right at home. Rather than being shipped off to Europe, Asia, or premium supermarkets, American milk is being dumped near unused farms. Meanwhile, Canada speaks softly but acts decisively and is quietly capturing global market share. Since mid-2025, Canada slapped import duties as high as 300% on U.S. milk that exceeds a small quota under its supply management system designed to protect domestic producers. As a result, over 90% of American milk exported to Canada has been halted. Trucks of U.S. milk have turned back, leaving millions of liters stuck in cold storage in states like Wisconsin, Vermont, and Idaho. Despite falling prices down over 30% in July, demand vanished as consumers grew wary or dismissed it as returned surplus. If you've seen 1-gallon cartons of whole milk drop from $4.20 to $2.90 at stores like Walmart or Kroger, that's not good news. It's a sign that the market is in crisis. With exports to Canada blocked, U.S. dairy entered a downward spiral. Production continued, but buyers disappeared. According to USDA, nearly 1,700 smaller dairy farms risked closure in Q2 2025. America once held 18% of the global dairy market, but by mid-2025, that plunged to under 9%, a 2-decade low. This crisis goes beyond farmers. Rural communities that rely on dairy are feeling the pinch. Schools cutting lunches, local stores left empty, banks tightening credit, and jobs vanishing. If you once lived in a small town anchored by a dairy plant, now you may see that plant shuttered, hiring signs removed, and an entire community in limbo. It's not just Canada. Key global partners are turning away U.S. dairy. The European Union added U.S. milk to a retaliatory tariff list, covering $72 billion in exports. Japan and Australia tightened import standards, starting June 2025. The issue isn't quality, it's labeling transparency. Many countries require clear disclosure of growth hormone, RBST, antibiotic use, or farm source labels not mandatory in the US. Trucks of milk and cheese are being returned. Much of this excess supply is sold domestically at deep discounts, 1 gallon for as low as $1.80 instead of $3.50. But the real cost is trust. Americans are asking, if others won't buy this milk, what's in it? Confidence in the U.S. dairy industry is eroding. While the U.S. grapples with oversupply and trade retaliation, Canada quietly expands its global dairy footprint through solid planning, supply control, and farm support. Its supply management system limits oversupply, bans growth hormones and excess antibiotics, and ensures full traceability from farm to table. Exported Canadian dairy clearly states these standards, which many importing countries now expect. As a result, Canada has gained market share in Japan, South Korea, the EU, and even the Middle East. Canadian dairy export revenues surpassed 4.2 billion Canadian dollars in the first half of 2025, up nearly 18% from the same period in 2024. While U.S. families shop for those discounted cheese packs or milk jugs, they may not realize local dairy farmers are shutting operations, halting milking, or selling off farms. If this continues, the U.S. dairy sector faces more than lost markets. It risks losing the next generation of farmers once raised on its own family milk.
With tariff talks top of mind, South Florida farmers say they're in trouble. Crops are rotting on the vine, and they're blaming the ongoing trade wars and immigration changes.
It all started with a tax order, just one government decision. And suddenly, the U.S. finds itself short on tomatoes and losing more than just produce. If your pizza seems more expensive lately, you're not imagining it. While Washington tightened the door on Mexico, Ottawa quietly opened theirs, and Canadian farmers are the ones cashing in. But behind the headlines and the multi-billion-dollar numbers are things that hit closer to home. Pricier ketchup, restaurant menus being trimmed, and everyday Americans footing the bill for a political move. What's really going on? Here's the picture. Starting July 14th, 2025, the U.S. Department of Commerce officially pulled out of its tomato trade suspension agreement with Mexico, imposing a 17% tariff on all fresh tomatoes coming in from our southern neighbor. The reason? To prevent underpricing and to support struggling farmers in Florida and Arizona. But there's a catch. Mexico supplies about 70% to 93% of the fresh tomatoes consumed in the U.S. So, this policy shift hit like a shockwave. If you usually buy a box of tomatoes for around $3, expect to see that jump to $3.30 or more within a few weeks. And it doesn't stop there. Pizza sauce, ketchup, salsa, these staples could all see price bumps. That burger or pizza slice you enjoy might soon cost an extra 50 cents to $1. 2. Canada moves in on the opportunity. While the U.S. was closing the gate, Canada was busy rolling out the welcome mat. In July 2025, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum met with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to announce a major expansion of their agricultural trade relationship. Mexico's cold chain logistics sector, critical for keeping produce fresh, hit $4 billion in value in 2024 and is expected to reach $6 billion by 2029. That's a solid base for tomato exports to grow fast. In the first half of 2025 alone, Canada pulled in $2.8 billion in tomato revenue, largely from rerouted Mexican supply. And with fewer trade hurdles, Canadian shoppers are getting top-quality Mexican tomatoes for around $2.50 a box, roughly 20 to 25% cheaper than what U.S. shoppers are paying at the same time. Pulling out of the Mexico agreement has led to real supply gaps in the U.S. Tomato prices are expected to rise another 6% to 10% by August 2025. Restaurants and food chains, Wendy's, Taco Bell, even household names like Heinz and DiGiorno are all rethinking their game plans. A 30 cc bottle of Heinz ketchup that used to cost $4.29 is now listed at $4.79 in major chains like Target and Walmart. Smaller restaurants are either raising prices or cutting back on tomatoes in their recipes. That means American diners are now directly feeling the impact of a trade policy that may have sounded distant, but now hits right on the dinner plate.